test automation as well. That will be helpful. Okay. So, um, okay. Other question is like, what is the thing that we are going through currently in our session?
Objects.
Discussing about the objects.
Objects. Yep.
Objects.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So let's start sharing the screen. Right. That means most of the people are following the session. Okay. So we are in the discussion of an object that we have seen in the previous session, where how do we declare an object? Ultimately, whatever the type of object that you see will be converted at the end to the literal object itself. And that is what we have seen with the example where we try to print this test one. And we have seen that this is similar to the literal objects that we have described over here. If you again try to execute this, you will see something over here, which is tsx objects.ps. And then you'll see that the last one, which is displaying as a part of the class object that we have created over here, it's also similar to anyone's trying to speak anything. Okay. I hope I am audible and you are able to see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Praveen. Yeah.
So this is also similar to however we have defined in terms of. I believe everyone should have an access to mute and unmute. If any one of you see like someone is unmuted by mistake or something, please unmute. Please mute, sorry. Okay, you should be having the access to mute others, so you can do that if there will be any kind of disturbance that you see. Okay, so first thing that we have seen is a literal object. Generally, we'll be using a literal object way of declaration of an object, and mostly other than that, we'll be using the class way of declaration of an object. Okay, so literal object, I hope you people are clear, which we define the objects directly inside the curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we'll be writing something in the form of key and value pair. And those key and value pair will be separated with a comma. All the keys and value pair will be separated with a comma. And internally, those key and value pair will be separated with a colon inside that. Okay. We have also understood whenever you try to access these values outside of like outside of the scope of this, which is inside, we have written inside the object, and you are trying to accept or access this inside the function inside the object itself, we generally have to use a this keyword. And what is this keyword? Basically refers to the current object. Either you are creating an object in this way or you are creating an object for the class. Okay, that will basically refers to the object of a class or object of a object that you have defined over here. So if you already know the object that you have defined, you can use a person dot. If you do not know, then you have to basically use a this. And whenever you create an object over here, as we have seen in this case, that refers to the this over here. So this keyword is similar to the object that you have created over here for this particular test one. Okay, let me comment it for now. Now, this was basically the first one that we have seen for the literal objects. Now, when we talk about a TypeScript, there are three more different ways in which we can declare the similar type of object. The same type of object we can declare. However, we have utilized the literal object, but the only difference is you can also provide the type of the data that you are trying to use inside the object. And that becomes the using inline type object or type aliases or using an interface. Let's try to see how do we say it in terms of using in the different ways over here. Okay, so in this case, when we start writing the object, second way of writing, yes.
Hello, Praveen.
Yes.
Praveen, just one doubt actually on this. Function which you have written right in a literal object. Can we call that in console.log as well? Person dot function. I mean person info in console.log.
Basically, you are trying to print something over here, right? So if you are already writing console.log, then there is no need of. You can also write it, but it will give you one more in one more print that is undefined.
Yeah, that's what I was getting undefined, so that's why I was just
Right. So why it will give undefined is I'll tell you. So what happened over here is this is giving you, this is basically what is person.person info. Person.person info will get replaced with this one. This is console.log and other things. So console.log and everything over here will come into picture. Now what you are doing is what you are seeing is 2 times console.log. So
okay.
console.log and then here as well console.log. So first time
o-
it will print you the value and for the second time it will give you the undefined value.
Undefined. Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
That
okay.
is
Yeah.
why you might be getting undefined.
Yes. That's why I was just having why it was showing undefined. Okay.
Mhm. Okay,
Okay. Okay. Fine. Thank you.
great. No problem. Okay. Now let's go ahead and see for this type of things that you see over here is basically usable one time only. That means you cannot use this particular structure that you have defined over here. The structure that you have defined is like inside curly braces, which is name one, John, age, so on, so, and some other things. You cannot use for the other object. That means you have declared an object and you cannot use this particular object or this particular structure to create the similar things similar another object. That means if you want to create another object, you have to again create the similar kind of things. Again, let's say it as a person one, and then you have to define the similar things. Let's say even if you are just trying to change the name, age, and this value, at that point of time also you have to create a new branded one object over here with some other name, right? This is basically disadvantage that we have when you go for a literal object, but generally, whenever we try to create an object, that will be utilized once only. Most of the time it will be utilized once only. If it is not, if it is utilizable multiple times, then we'll basically go for the class way of declaration of an object. But let's see what inline type says that. When we talk about an inline type, that means it generally derive a contract. It generally derive a contract. What is that contract? So it says that a const person one that you have defined an object, and though you are trying to use this kind of value, it also says that you have to make a contract over here to define the type of the value that you are trying to use over here. As we have seen at the time of data types, which is let I colon number equals to something. That is a contract. That means I am trying to declare a variable I, which should be a type of number itself or numeric itself. Okay, so that is basically a contract. So it says that you have to make a contract over here that inside the inline tag, it means you have to define here the key and value pair, and only those key and value pair you have to use inside the object. Let's see what I'm trying to say. So you have to say it as, let's say, name one colon. This should be a form of string. In second value, you say it as, let's say, is colon. This should be in the form of number. In third value, you say it as a is employed. Let's say is employed, and that should be a value as, let's say, boolean. Okay, and then the last one you can say it as, let's say, the key should be as a person info, and then this should be in the form of a function that you are trying to define. So it says that let's say define at a function. Okay, now what happened over here is we have made an inline contract. That means in the same line we are trying to also define the type of the object that we are trying to define inside this particular person one. Type of the, that means object type that we are trying to define over. Okay, we have defined this type. However, we basically define for the variable. In the same way, you can also define the type of the object that you are trying to create. Now, this will be basically helpful for us in terms of API response validation. When you are trying to expect exactly the similar name, let's say message equals to so and so, user ID equals to so and so, token name equals to so and some other things. There we can validate that the key should have to be the value that I have provided over here. Instead of this, if you want to use name, you cannot use because you have given the key should have to be the key one. Sorry, name one. If you hover over on this, it says that the object literal may only specify known properties, but name does not exist in the type. What is the type? You have defined as a name one, age, is employed, and person info. So whatever the key that you have defined, the similar key you have to define it over here. And whatever the value that you have defined in the form of, let's say, a string, that should have to be in the form of string itself. It's saying that you have defined as a part of string, but you're trying to declare a number over here. Okay, so here we are also making a contract to define the key. The key that you have mentioned over here have to be the same key. If you want to change, let's say age one, you cannot change. If you want to change, then you have to change it at the inline as well. Okay, this is known as an inline type object. Apart from the concept are exactly same, but you can also define the key and value pair that you are trying to expect. Okay, and whatever the key that you have given, you have to define those keys only. If you mention it as, let's say, person info as a string, and you are trying to store a function, then it will complain us saying that type is this one for the person info that you have defined, but you basically have defined as a string over here. You can simply say it as a function. Okay, that means you are saying that the key that I'm trying to use, you have to use the same type of key. This probably we might not use anytime, but this used to be an interview question, that what is difference between literal object and inline type object. In terms of a literal object, you are free to use anything over here. You can also change name, name one to name, and you can mention a name over here. But in terms of inline type, you are not free to utilize this. You're basically not free to utilize this. You have to utilize the same key that you have defined inside the inline. And that becomes the inline type object, which is only available in TypeScript. Okay, concept are same. How do you get the value? In the same way. How do you basically let's say if you want to change the value, you can change in just by using person.name equals to some other value. You can assign it over here. You can also assign that, like you can simply say it as a person dot name, and earlier we have used a John, and now you can simply say it as equals to Rahul. So what you are saying is I'm just changing from John to Rahul, the name over here. And when you try to print this, you will see that instead of earlier as it was printing us John over here, this time it will print Rahul as a value. So you can also change that as well. Okay. But apart from that, every concept that we have gone for the literal object are same inside the inline type object as well. But the only difference is that you are also trying to say that, okay, I need only these kind of key, which will be helpful in terms of the response validation of the API. Yes.
Yeah, so in inline type object, we'll be able to change the name afterwards or not?
Name you can change it out. There will not be an issue because you are just trying to change the value of the variable.
Okay,
Okay, this
only the
only
type
the
is mandatory.
correct. Only
Okay.
the name that you have given over here that you cannot change.
Okay, also the variable name and the type I have to give the same as per
Exactly.
defined. Okay.
Exactly. Okay. So that is the inline type. Again, in this case as well, if you see, you will only be able to use it one times. That means if you again want to create another type, then you have to use a person two then you have to define the similar kind of things, and you can use probably the different inputs over here. Okay, so this will also be again available one time only. One time accessible only. Now, now let's say the third point or the third type that we have, which says that this is also available in TypeScript itself, which is using a type aliases. Okay, using a type alias over here. Now, what is using a type alias? So we have seen till now that we have declared an object using a literal object, which is we have defined directly the value. Inline object, we have made a contract that this contract only we have to use it out. But this again, the contract that you have made, you have available only for this particular person1 object. When you try to create a person2 object having the similar kind of key and value, you have to again define it out. Right? That means you cannot use this multiple times. If you want to use this multiple times, then we can make it a alias over there. That means you can simply make a type alias over here by using a type alias. What is the syntax for this? The syntax to define this is type alias means we have a keyword known as type. We have basically a keyword known as type. Okay, and then using this keyword, you can provide some name over here that is known as alias name. That means some temporary name that I'm trying to provide to someone. Okay, so I'll say it as, let's say, this is the syntax. So type and then name of the variable, you can define it all. So variable name. And then you have to use a equal to, and inside this, you can say it as a key that you want to use and the type of value that you want to use over here. This is exactly similar to this one, but this one will be utilized only once. This contract can only be utilized for this person1 only. You cannot use it for the multiple one. If you want to use, then again you have to write this one in the same way. Right? There comes the type, which says that if you want to utilize the same contract for multiple types of object with which is only changing some kind of value, there you can use a type alias. Let's see what happened in this case. You can simply say it as a type, and then let's say I'll just say it as a name as a human beings. Okay, equals to whatever the value that you have to give, you can give it inside over here. So that will consist of a name, which is as a part of string. Second, you can say it as a age as a part of number. And then third, let's say address or city, which will only get the value as string over here. So this is again, we have made a contract. That means only I require a key, which is name, age, and city, and in the form of string, number, and string. Okay, now what happened is whenever you try to create any of the object, let's say I'll say it as let person2, let person2. And inside this, if you want to define an inline object, you can simply say it as I need a human to be declared over here. And what is human? Human consists of the name, age, and city as an object, which is again a contract. Okay, and then you can again define it over here, which is name, let's say some values, let's say in terms of some other values, then age, colon, let's say something which is 34, and then city, which they're staying in something, let's say a little. Okay. But again, if you try to change name one, it will throw an error because inside this human that you have made a contract is not available as a name one. So if you hover over on this, it says that name one is not available. Object literal may only specify known, but name one does not exist on in the type human. So this becomes now the type, and this can be utilized for multiple objects. You can again create the similar one having only the change in the input, and you can create a third one as well. Only the change as input. So this time you can say that, let's say some other values having some different values, and here this can be, let's say, New York. So what happened is you are only changing the value, but the type that you are trying to use, right, you have just created once, and that you can utilize for multiple objects. Okay, The type use of the type aliases is to just create a contract once and can be utilized for multiple objects wherever you are trying to use the same type of validation. Okay. So that is where we basically use a type alias to define a contract once and can be utilized at multiple places. Okay. In the same way, and apart from that, every concept is same. How do you get the value in the same way? How do you basically utilize like how do you utilize the value? That is also in the same way. How do you utilize means how do you get the value? How do you define the function? Everything you can define in the same way over here as well. You can also mention, let's say, a person info over here, or next type as a person, and then you can simply say that this should only accept a function. So you have to define a function. So the contact have been changed, and that you have to define it over here, saying that a person and this person um, should just print some kind of things. Let's say console.log, something over here. Anything, whatever you want to print, but you have to write it in this way. You have to define a person as a function when the contract have been changed on all the values, all the variable, wherever you are trying to create an object using a human as a things. Okay, so this
So
type
it is mandatory to have one of them while defining it using the contract.
this is not mandatory, but if you are trying to create the similar
Like-
type of
Like if I have person two, I can just define name, age, and city. That is okay, or I have to define the function person also.
you also have to define a function over here.
So all are mandatory.
Right. Whatever the format that you have given, you have to define unless you have defined as an optional parameter. This is an optional parameter, right? When you mark something as a question mark, that becomes an optional parameter that we have discussed at the time of functions. Optional parameter. How do you define an optional parameter? By just making it as a question mark on any of the parameter. The same concept applies over here as well. You can simply mark it as a question mark, and that will not be a mandatory. Even from here as well, you can remove this. So if you do not want something to be available for all, you can simply mark it as a question mark. That means optional parameter. Okay, I hope it might have answered.
Yeah, and in line number 63, there should be a comma, right? After number.
Right.
Praveen, we can also create array, right? Like here you created a person two or person three, right? So instead of a person three, the person two itself, we can make it an array, just so can give a square brackets and we can.
Right,
just,
that becomes an array concept. That
Yeah.
becomes an array concept. You can define it over here inside the array, and inside the like semicolon,
Yeah.
you can define multiple objects. I believe we had seen at the time of sometimes inside the array this kind of value. When something accepts a callback function. Yes, this kind of things.
Right.
So you can define it, but that becomes an array concept. Here we
Yeah.
are in the object concept. So you can define like multiple objects inside the array as well.
Yeah, the structure follows same human, right? The type.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so this is type. The disadvantage of this is you cannot use inside the class. Whenever you create a class, you cannot use inside the type aliases over there. So you cannot define using the type aliases inside the class. Whenever you are trying to create some kind of object and you are trying to make the contract, you cannot use. Then basically we do not require this, but it has given the concept which help us in terms of the interviews. So I'm trying to explain over here. And there comes the next one, which is known as interface way of declaration of an object. Using an interface. Interface concept in Java, if you are from the background of Java, and JavaScript and TypeScript are different. Okay, we do not require any OOPS concept over here because this is a functional programming language, not an object-oriented programming language. JavaScript and TypeScript are functional programming language, which also supports an object-oriented features like class, object, inheritance, and so on. Okay, now what interface is, that is, you can also create a contract, however you have created for type. In the same way, you can also create a contract using interface keyword. Using interface keyword, you will also be able to create. Okay. Able to see my screen, right? Any disconnect over here on the screen?
No, so far good today. Everything is fine.
Okay. Right. So when we talk about interface, like we have the another type where we have an interface way of declaration of an object. And we can also use a keyword known as interface to create an object. Okay, now let's see also how do we create an object using an interface way. So here we have used a type way where we have given a type, and equal, like some kind of variable name equals to the value that we wanted to make it as a contract over here. So that we have given in this way. Okay, now what happened in terms of when we try to use a TypeScript? Let's see the syntax. How do we basically define the how do we have basically the type in terms of defining the interface way of declaration of an object? Basically, both type and interface are used to define the shape of an object. Shape means the contract to create an object. Okay, but both of them have some kind of differences. So how do we basically define it? By using an interface. You can also create an interface to basically utilize it for the multiple objects that we'll see over here. So interface, and then you have to provide the name of the interface over here. Interface, and then you can provide a name, and inside the curly braces, whatever the value that you have to define, you can define it in the key and value pair. Here, in terms of a type, we have a type and then some kind of name that you can define it over here equals to inside the curly braces. Where we have in terms of an interface, you can simply define a keyword known as interface and then give the name. Let's say example, a users. Okay, and again, you can define some kind of things, which is it should have a name, it should have an age, which will be again in the form of number. It should be, let's say, role, or let's say create an employee. Create an employee over here, which have a name, age, and what is the role of the employee, and probably what is the salary of the employee that they are getting over here. Salary also should be in the form of number. So this is again, we have made a contract over here, right? What happened in terms of interfaces? Interface also supports basically an extension part of the things. That means you can also combine two different types of interface. You can also combine two different types of interface, but type will not do that. What is by that is I'll explain in next few minutes of time. So here, if you try to see, we have this one where I'll again try to use this, which is let person food, and then I'll just make it as an employee as a contract. So what is the employee as a contract? Then it is throwing us that we do not have city available. We have a role. So let's say we have a role, and which I'll give the name as software engineer. And then we again have another, which is a salary. So that also you have to define. If you are not making it as a optional parameter, then you also have to make it over here as a value. If you have an optional, then there is nothing to define that. So salary, let's say 1 lakh rupees. Example. Okay, so again, this employee that you see is the similar one that we have defined for the type as well. Right? That we have basically defined for the type. But what happened in this case is, let's say we have this one contract, and I am also creating another contract, which is interface over here. Okay, I'm again creating another contract, which is now again having the same name, which is employee. And inside this, I can also say it as, let's say, what is the department? Department is IT or any other things. In this case, what happened is both of the interface have been merged over here. When you provide some kind of the similar name, you can also provide in terms of the interface. When you provide it, both of them, both of the value that you have given over here have been merged. That means these two have been merged over here. Now it started throwing us an error saying that department is required, which is missing over here. So that department basically will be in the form of string, and that department you have to mention it over here as a part of, again, this department, which is, let's say, IT department. Okay. But in this case, if you try to define the similar type over here, this will not be allowed. It says that you cannot duplicate identifier string. So in terms of a type, you cannot basically define this. But in general, in terms of interface, if you want to merge two different things which have been utilized for two different values, then you can also merge it by creating the two different interface over here. Okay, and not only that, you can also create another interface. Let's say I'll create an interface which I'll just give the name as some other things over here. Let's say we have an employee. I'll just say it as a company. And this company that we have created as an interface can also extend this one, extends the employee interface that we have used. Extend the employee interface that we have used. That means we are deriving another contract depending on the other contract that we have created over here. So in this case, now this becomes invalid. So you do not require over here. Now, when you try to create, let's say person 4, person 5, and you are using a company as a contract, there it requires you to add the department over here, which is missing in this case. So it has to be like you have to provide the department over here as well. Department, which is okay. So why do we use interface? Because you can create multiple interface with the same name. All those values will be merged, or you can also use one interface to create another contract as well by just using an extends keyword. Extends means all the properties that you have defined inside the employee have been extended over here as well. Okay, and as it has given the extend property, so it is useful in terms of like making a contract inside the class. Okay, so this is also utilized for multiple way of multiple type of creation of an object of the same type. Same type means similar contract that you have defined over here.
Praveen, one question here.
Yes.
Line number 78, 79, 80. For these three yeah, you see that now there was no comma for these three lines. Why it was not showing any error there?
So in terms of an interface declaration, in terms of a type interface, it automatically considered that every value have been separated with a comma. Even if you do not define it over here inside this, it considered that all the values are separated. It considered like however we define a semicolon over here, right?
Yeah.
Either you define it or not define it, it will consider the end of the line. So in this case as well, it basically considered the end of the line over here.
Oh, okay.
And that is where it did not throw us any kind of error saying that
Yeah,
you
that's what even I surprised.
But when you try to do in this case, in the same line, if you're trying to write it, it basically asks you to define a comma.
Okay, in line. Mhm.
Okay, in the same line, in the same sentence, if you're trying to define, then it will ask you to define a comma over there. But if you're
Oh,
trying to define in multiple lines, it automatically consider that all the values are separated.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yes. Yes, go
Uh,
ahead. Yes. Yes.
can you explain the difference between this interface and type once again? I got this extends part, but apart from that, is there any difference?
So you can basically like whenever you have to use inside the class these kind of contract declaration, whenever you have to create inside the class, because it has a property of extends, so you can use interface way of creation of an object inside the class. If you are trying to define, basically we do not require, but in case if you are trying to define inside any of the class, then we can use an interface to declare an object. Whereas type will not be applicable inside the class. Type way of declaration of an object will not be applicable inside the class. Second
Okay.
is you can define the same name of the interface multiple times. Whatever the value that you define will get merged automatically, whereas you cannot define by using the same name of the type aliases over there.
Okay. Okay. Got it.
Okay, yes, Ramin. I saw that there was one more hand raised.
Yeah, Praveen, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
So what is the real-time example like for this interface thing? Like, where exactly we do this? I mean,
So real time, basically, as I said, no, you will not be utilizing this kind of facilities that it has given to create an object. But the real time is like, let's say, whenever you are trying to create a multiple objects of the same type. Let's say what happened inside the companies, right? What happened inside the organization? They'll store a different kinds of employees, right? Different types of different employees database, right? And inside the employees database, they'll have a different numbers. So what they generally try to do is whenever they try to create and they try to basically do some kind of operations, so they'll have all the data available as an object, which is name something, age something, salary. At the time of appraisal, they can simply make it as, okay, I need these kind of people who will have the similar kind of structure defined as a name and other things, and then increase the salary for those employee by 20% or 10%, whatever the things is there. Okay, so those kind of value, those kind of operation that they can make it inside. However, we have seen at the time of going through with the array over here, right? So any kind of operation that you can use, but the value will be stored inside the object itself.
no,
And it
like what I'm asking is with regards to the, test automation, right? Like, so
zero.
where exactly like do we do this is what
No.
I'm.
In terms of a test automation, as I said, like we'll never be using this.
Okay, okay.
No use in terms of the test automation.
Okay, so you mean to say in perspective of the development side, they
Right.
still this object. Okay, okay,
Right.
okay,
So these are basically all the things have been given for the development purpose, but there used to be some interview questions. That is why I'm trying to explain over.
okay, okay.
Okay, but when we talk about a usage in terms of the test automation, we'll only be going for literal objects and going for a class. Apart from that, nothing will be using over here.
Okay.
Okay. Now constructor function way, as we have just seen inside the class, so we can define a constructor where we can initialize the value inside the class. And that basically becomes the constructor function, which is a function which we inside this, we are trying to just store some kind of value, which will be helpful for us in terms of initialization as and when we create an object for this class. So whatever the value that you provide over here, whatever the value that you provide over here will get initialized inside the constructor. This Rahul will go and sit in place of A, and this beef will be replaced with 80. And at this point of time, this name one become Rahul, age become 80. And whenever you try to access this by using test1.name1, this will give us a value as Rahul in this place. So the constructor function basically help us in initialization of a value of a variable. Whatever the value that we are trying to generate over here, that we are basically trying to initialize in the case of constructor function. Okay. Now, if you are again from the Java background, you might be knowing that whenever we create a constructor function inside the class, constructor function should have the same name as the class name. Whereas in terms of JavaScript and TypeScript, we have a keyword known as a constructor to create a constructor inside a class. We do not have a concept that you have to declare the same name as you have declared for the class name. No. Yeah, we have a constructor keyword, which will help us in creating a constructor.
Does it allow multiple constructors?
You can create a multiple constructor as well over here. You can simply write it with whatever the number that you are trying to write
It's
it over
called
here.
overloading, right? Constructor overloading.
Overloading. But as we have seen in terms of the function overloading, what happened? Generally, it does not allow in terms of overloading kind of things, right? You can define it over here and make some kind of value as a optional parameter, right? But in general, whenever we go for declaration of a constructor, in any ways, right? In any ways, that will just give you only one type inside this. You can define it, but it starts throwing us an error because it says that you cannot define the same function inside the JavaScript and TypeScript in the same way. Multiple constructor implementation are not allowed, as we have seen at the time of function, where you provide the something inside the function and it will start you throwing some kind of error. Okay, so implementation is not possible when you are trying to define a multiple constructors. General use of a constructor over here will be not similar to however we use in terms of an object-oriented programming, where we define a constructor. You can define multiple constructor in the overloaded, parameterized, non-parameterized. That is not allowed over here. So one type of constructor that you have to use inside both JavaScript and TypeScript.
So in Java C# default, there will be one constructor for each class. Likewise here, unless user create here, there won't be any constructor, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So that comes inside the class. We'll discuss a class at the end. So constructor function, we have just seen one. And let's discuss about the factor function and then we'll move to the classes. So discuss regarding how do we create an object using a factor functions over here. So I'll just move to the sixth one, which is using a factory function. Now, what is factor function? Factor function is generally a function, is a normal function. Okay, factor function is generally a normal function, which basically returns us as an object. A function which returns an object is known as a factor function. A function which returns an object is known as a factoring function. Okay, so this will simply return a function, return an object. A factor function, a function which will return an object, is known as a factor function. This is also a normal function and a named function you can define, and this function will simply return us an object. So what is the syntax over here? So syntax is however we define the function. In the same way, we have to define it over here as well, which is starting with a function keyword. You can provide the function name as well. This function can take also some kind of argument, and then whatever the code that we have to write it, we have to write it inside this curly braces, and at the end we have to return something. And what we have to return over here is we have to return an object. Okay. Yes. I see. Okay. Somehow it might be getting. Pramil, do you want to ask any question? I'm sorry if you're talking, but I'm unable to hear. Do anyone able to hear him?
Yeah, you are audible, Praveen. You are good today. So no issues.
Okay. Well, Pramil, I'm sorry, but I'm not able to hear you anything. If you're trying to speak, I'm not able to hear you. Does any other person are able to hear Pramil Modi
No,
over here?
Praveen.
No,
No.
right?
No, we are
Yeah,
not
we're
able.
able to hear.
Okay.
No, we are not able to hear familiar voice.
Your
Right.
voice is audible. Yeah, his
Okay.
voice can.
Great. Okay.
You can hear me okay, right? Yeah.
Yes, yes, I can.
Thank you.
Okay. So you can just type it, Femil, if you have any question, and I'll come back to answer them. Okay. So a function, factor function is a normal function that we create, but the only difference is that it will return an object. Example, let's say we'll create a function which I'll give the name as car as a function, which accepts some kind of value, which is, let's say, model, year of manufacturing, and then the number of seat. Let's say example, it is accepting, and inside this we can write some kind of logic. If you want to write some kind of logic, you can write it inside over here, and at the end it's simple, return an object. What is object? Inside the curly braces having a key and value pair. Okay, so you can simply say it as, let's say, model one. If you want to define some other values, then you can simply say it as a other value. That means a name as an other like variable different than the value that we are trying to use over here that we can use. And then again say it as, let's say, year, the year one colon year over here. Again, we have to provide it comma in this case. And then we can also, let's say, seat one equals to seat. So what happened in this case is this function, whenever you call this particular function, right? So how do we call this function? By simply using a name of the function, right? And inside this, we can say it as, um, let's say something which is BMW. And then we have some i7 series over there, and then the number of seat is, let's say, 5 example. Okay, so whenever you try to call this particular function, we know that this will return something, so we can store it inside a variable, and that I'll say it as, let's say, car. And if you try to print this car will give us the value in the same way as we try to create an object. So what happened ultimately over here is we have returned something inside the curly braces. So this becomes our model one becomes our the property name or variable name, and model, this value, whenever you call this particular function, this value will go and set it in the place of these, and this will get initialized over here, and that value it will return as a part of car that we are trying to print over here. Okay, so in this case again you will see that
Am I audible now, Praveen?
yes, you are.
Okay.
Just check it out. Okay. And then use a TSX, and we are getting the value which is model one over here. Model one over here, which is BMW. Then year one is a i7, and then seat one is a 5 seat over here. Right? So this is again in the form of object itself, which is key value pair. So this is also one way where we can create an object. But here, if you see, we do not require a new keyword to create an object. Yeah, we do not require a new keyword. So whenever you do not require a new keyword and you do not require this keyword to store the variable or to initialize the variable, there we can directly create a factor function to create an object. Again, this will be not utilized in terms of the test automation. We'll only rely upon two things. One is the inline object, and second is the class way of creation of an object. Okay, but this is another way where we can define an object. So the question will be like, what are the different ways in which you can create an object? So you have to answer all these things. Yes, Framil, go ahead if you have any question.
Yeah. So can you please go to that inline way of declaration of object?
Mhm.
Yeah. So like we have declared the object with the data types right over here. But
Yes.
let's say I would like to, I mean, see these values to the terminal, I mean, I would like to execute this code, then how should I do that? I mean, should I refer the person one dot something?
So if you want to get this value, which is name one, right? In the same way, however, you have used it over here. So how did we use over here? So in the same way, you can execute this, which is person one, which is your object name over here. Person one is an object name for this one. And then you can see person one dot whatever the value that you have given, which is name one in this case and age one in this case. And this will also return the value with whatever the value we
But
have, which
all
is
the things that which we have declared in the function as well, right? So, shouldn't it directly I call the function with the person one dot person info?
yes,
So it
yes, you can simply do that person one dot person info as well using the parenthesis.
okay.
Okay, because this is a
And
function that we have stored, so we have to call it with parenthesis.
yeah,
Yes,
and in the third example, how should we do the execution like? Because
same
here
way,
we have defined. Okay,
completely same way. We have only the difference is the person two and person three, but other remains same. Other things remain same, exactly remain same over here. So if you see in this case,
so we don't need to include the human one over here, right?
no, nothing. Human is just a contract that we have made to define a data type. If you want to do it over here, you can simply change to person two name and then person two an object. That's it.
Okay,
The
thanks. Got it.
execution will remain same for all the type that we have seen over here. Even in this case, if you want to get, you just have to say it as car dot model one.
Okay,
Okay, but execution will remain same for all the type of objects that we have seen. Car one dot car dot model one, it is returning as a BMW. And here it Rahul 30 is on 30 is 34 and so on. It is returning as a part of person two, person one that we have used.
okay, thanks.
Great. Okay. Okay. Now we come to the last step that we have is known as a class way of declaration of an object, class style of declaration of an object. Okay. How do we create a class? How do we create basically class in terms of an JavaScript and TypeScript? Let's try to see it over here. Okay. So for that, I'll create a class. I'll just give the name as class, or let's give some kind of name as employee over here, employee.ts. So I've just given a name as a class. Okay, now let's try to understand the background as well. So when JavaScript and TypeScript came into picture, right, that was completely a functional programming language. That means it was not having any kind of support of object-oriented programming. When we talk about an object-oriented, that means it was not even supporting the class creation as well. It was not even supporting the class creation. That means there was a time when using a JavaScript and TypeScript, we were not able to create the class as well. Nothing. Only the create a file, and inside the file, whatever you have to write in the term, write in the form of function. Okay. Then there comes like class that have been introduced in ES6 engine. This is known as version 6. Okay, in the version 6 that have been introduced in 2015. What is ES stands for? ES stands for ECMA script. ECMA script is a format. ECMA script is a format that how do we have to use JavaScript and TypeScript. Okay, this is just a format. How do we use JavaScript and TypeScript? And that have been introduced in 2015. Before 2015, we were not having any concept of classing both JavaScript and TypeScript. Okay, but after 2015, the concept have been given for the class as well. Okay, now the comes like how do we declare a class? Do we have any such format where we can declare a class, or do we have any like kind of syntax that it has given? Yes, we do have a syntax over here as well. But let's it is like 2209. Let's concentrate for the next 15 minutes. And I see like few people are from the other time zone as well. So and today is also Friday, so I will try to complete it as soon as possible. But we'll go in detail. That doesn't mean like there'll be any kind of compromise. Okay, so syntax. What is the syntax that we have in terms of declaration of a class? Let's try to see over here. So whenever we create a class, first thing that we have to use is we have to use a keyword known as class. And then you have to provide a class name. And we have some kind of nomenclature when you try to declare a function that should be starting with a lowercase, but when you try to create a class, that should start with a uppercase letter. That means camel case will be all the things that like uppercase. That means you have started with uppercase and following words should start with uppercase itself. Okay, whereas in terms of function, function name should start with a lowercase and following words should start with the uppercase letter. Okay. So this is the class name and then the curly braces starts. And inside this curly braces, we have to define whatever we have to define, like properties. You can define it over here. You can say it as, let's say, key1, key2, some kind of properties that I'm just trying to make it over here. You can also define a data type for uh, this property, which is key. And here as well, you can define the data type. If you do not want, you can also just leave it. So in terms of a declaration of properties inside the class, you can define the properties in different ways. One is a normal properties. You can also define a static keyword as well, static properties as well, which is, let's say, key3, static key3. Now, what is static and other things? I'll explain in next sometime. Okay, and whatever the variable that you have declared, over here, which is non-static, those non-static variable, we have to initialize it inside the constructor. So for that, we'll be creating a constructor using a keyword known as a constructor. Okay, and that value we can define it over here, which is key1 and key2. And these value have to be initialized using this keyword. Why using this keyword? Because we know that this will be this basically refers to an object, and whenever we use this keyword, that will simply be replaced with an object whenever we create an object for a class. Okay, you can also use a static keyword as well. That means you can define a property which is static in nature. What is the use of that? I'll talk about in next few minutes. Okay, so this constructor will help us in assigning the value to a variable. That means initializing the value that you have declared over here. Let's say you are trying to declare some locators, username, password, and that locators value you can define it inside the constructor. Okay. Now you might have seen some kind of difference. Okay, we have declared a variable, but we did not use any let keyword or const keyword over here. Right? We have not used. Right. So whenever you try to declare a variable inside, class, you do not have to use any kind of keyword inside the class. It is not required to declare any type of keyword inside the class, which is also not allowed to declare a variable inside the class using let, var, or const keyword. You can simply define the variable name, and that should work. You can also define the data type, that should also be allowed. Okay. In the same way, whenever you try to declare a function inside the class, it does not require a function keyword. So you can simply say it as, let's say this is a function. You can define the return type if you want to define the return type over here. And then whatever the value that you have to define, it will go inside the curly braces, whatever the logic that you have to define. So you do not have to use a function keyword again over here. This is again not allowed in terms of class. So class will identify if you have any kind of variable that you have defined using a variable over here at the class level. That will identify that, okay, we have declared a variable, which is properties, and these are the methods. And whenever you have declared a variable which is also having a parenthesis over here, that means it will automatically identify that you have declared a function over here. And you can also declare a static function as well by just using a static keyword. And then you can provide, let's say, a function name, which is let's say info1. And then you can again provide a return type if you want to provide. That is again non-mandatory. We have seen till now. And inside this, you can write whatever the code that you want to write it over here. Okay, so this basically becomes the complete syntax. How do we declare a variable inside this? And you can also declare a different types of variable. One is this is a variable. If you do not define any keyword, that becomes a public variable. If you also want to define a private variable, you can simply use a private key, and then you can say it as, let's say, key3 over here. You can mention it key4, this one as a static, and whatever the variable that you have defined as a non-static variable, those you have to initialize inside the constructor that you have created. Okay, so if you make it as a private, then that becomes a private to the class. What is in the private? Whenever you try to define a private variable or a private function, those variables and function you cannot use outside of the class. You cannot use outside of the class. And if something are a public in nature, which is variables and methods, those variables and method you can basically use inside the or inside and outside of the class anywhere. Okay, and what is difference between a static keyword and a non-static keywords over here, or non-static variable? Whenever you use a static keyword, that means those variables and those methods belongs to the class. Those variables and methods belong to the class. What is meant by that? The variable that you are trying to declare using a non-static keyword, that belongs to the object, not to the class. That belongs to the object. These variables belongs to the object. Those you are trying to initialize inside the constructor. But static
Praveen, this is
variable.
same for the all Java class too, right?
Yes,
The
yes.
same. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
But when you are trying to use a static variable or a static keyword, that belongs to the class. There is a slight difference over here that in terms of Java, you can access static keyword and static method by using the object as well. But in terms of JavaScript and TypeScript, it is strictly not allowed. Okay, so to access the variable which is non-static, to access the method which is non-static, you have to create an object to access it. Okay, now how do you create an object in terms of a class? It's a simple. In other programming language, which is Java, you have to give the class name over here. Then you have to create an object reference equals to, using a new keyword, you have to create basically class. And then whatever the constructor, whatever the argument that the constructor is taking, those value you have to provide it over here. Okay, this is in the form of Java. You create an object in this way. Whereas in terms of JavaScript and TypeScript, we'll just say it as let or const keyword object equals to new keyword, and then you have to give a class name over here. And whatever the parameter that it is, argument that it is taking, those parameters you have to provide it over here. That becomes the that basically becomes the parameter.
So the
And
let is a variable, right? Let
the-
object is equal to new
these are
class name.
variables. Yet.
Variables,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes.
And class name is it's a constructor, right? Class name, what you have.
Class name is the name that you have given for the class name.
Class name. Okay.
Right. That represents a constructor over here.
That represents a constructor. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, you got me. Yeah. Yeah, but it's different. The format is different. It says let object is equal to. Okay.
Right.
The syntax. Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Right. Yes. And whenever you have to access the non-static variable, you have to use a object. you have to basically use the object reference, which is object dot key1, or if you want to try also call the function, then object dot info as a function over here, right? But if you want to basically access the static keyword one, if you want to access the static keyword one, then you have to basically say that simple, a class name, whatever the class name that you have given, which is class name dot static keyword, which is key4 over here. And again, the class name dot function name, which is info1 over here. You cannot use this key4 and info1, you cannot call by using object over here. This is strictly not allowed in terms of both JavaScript and TypeScript. Class name, static keyword by you accessing the object is not allowed in terms of JavaScript and TypeScript. Okay. Also, you have given one more keyword, which is private in nature. So this private keyword, you cannot access it outside, even by creating an object. When you try to do this, which is key3, this is not allowed to access it outside of the class, because this private means this becomes private to the class over here. Okay, that's basically the complete structure that we have in terms of a class. Okay, and implementation of the class we'll see in our next session. Any question over here for now?
Yes,
I
I
mean,
have.
while
Yes. Go
So
ahead, one
while
by one.
declaring, yeah. So
yeah, go
while
ahead, go ahead.
yeah. So what I'm asking is like you have declared the class. Inside that, you have created the methods, right? And when you are initializing the object, that is completely outside the class, right?
Yes, yes, that is outside the class. So the class have been completed over here.
Okay.
So
And
this,
non-static keywords are it's mandatory to create an object to access those things.
yes, right.
Okay.
Static keywords and variables, static variables and methods you can access without creating an object, which is by just using the class name. And non-static variables and non-static method, you have to create an object mandatorily to access this outside of the class.
So just one question over here, Praveen. Whenever
Yes,
we are creating an object, we are declaring with the new keyword. I mean, creating the object with the new keyword, right?
right,
So in the function factory, we have not used the new keyword, right?
correct,
In the car
correct,
example. So
correct.
why is it so?
Right. So it returns an object. It says that this factor function, we are not creating an object. It is basically returning an object. This function
Okay.
itself is returning an object. When we go and create an object, we try to create by using a new keyword. But this function is not creating. This is returning itself an object.
Okay, got it.
Okay. And that is where this keyword is helpful. This function is helpful when you do not want to use this keyword and do not want to create an object by using a new keyword.
Okay, so here only we are returning the things in
Correct.
terms of the function
Correct.
factory. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Next question.
Yeah, can you
Shall
scroll above? Hello.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
It's just a small doubt. So inside the constructor that you have defined, key1, key2, key3, those are called as objects or arguments or what it's called?
Arguments.
Okay.
Arguments, not constructor function.
Okay.
These are arguments, and these becomes your variable name. Left side part that you see is your variable name. Right side part is the argument that will get replaced whenever you call using any of the parameter.
Okay. So I actually tried to declare using this keyword using the constructor, but it's not allowing me to write like this dot key1 is equals to key1. Instead, it's adding this dot key1 again.
Okay.
So
You will basically have to share your screen.
yeah, just a minute.
No worries. I'll just take the other question if someone is having.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then okay. By default, constructor will be created while creating class. No, we have to create a constructor over here. We have to create a constructor by self by using a constructor keyword. It will not be created by default.
Praveen, is it mandatory to create a constructor?
If you want to take something as a non-static keyword, then we have to create it mandatory. That means if you want to initialize some values, let's say you are directly initializing the value, which is key1 equals to something, key2 equals to something, and key3 equals to something. At that point of time, we do not require to initialize it. So we do not need a constructor to be created.
Okay. I mean, from the functions, we can provide the parameters, right, to for the classes. Suppose for the info function, if I wanted to pass some arguments, I can pass it
You can,
through
you
that.
can, you can
Uh,
provide arguments over
that,
here.
yeah, that time no need to create the constructor, right? So if at
No,
all you
for
want to use.
these, we do not require any constructor to be created if you're directly using inside the info, inside the class, inside the function. But where will you initialize this argument?
Okay.
Right?
So while calling,
If you're
yeah,
directly calling the function and you are just trying to provide some kind of value inside the function, you can do it. You can do that. Okay, inside the function as well, you can just take the arguments, but this kind of value, there might be a lot many values that can be available inside the class, right? Let's say you have different types of locators, right?
okay,
Different types of locators that you have. How will you initialize all the locators?
okay,
Right?
yeah.
So you'll be taking as an argument as a, let's say, username as a locator. But you will be providing a username then at the time of calling the function. That is not a better way of writing the code.
Correct. Yeah.
Correct. So that we can initialize it inside the constructor so that it will get initialized. And wherever we can use this key1, key2, key3, we can simply refer it by saying at this dot key1, wherever we want to use this.
Okay. Yeah. Understood.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Any other question for now?
Yeah, so
Okay.
just I just got one question from the previous one. So so this we define the keywords inside the sorry, we initialize the keywords inside the constructor, and then we can use those keywords wherever required in other methods inside the
Right.
class, right?
Right. Right. Yes.
Okay.
We'll see that. We'll see that once we create a framework, like phase object model framework inside the TypeScript in Playwright, we'll see that how do we create those kind of things.
Okay.
As an example as well, once we start on the Monday, we'll see as an example as well. Then we'll see like how do we get the values.
Yeah, that will be helpful, Praveen.
All right. Okay.
I think maybe I want to watch it once.